It's 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion has proved a massive failure for the Kennedy administration. All of a sudden, a communist country has sprung up in the United States backyard, and to the CIA, there's only one man to blame. At a meeting, Robert Kennedy announces their next course of action. We will take action against Castro. It might be tomorrow, it might be in 5 days or in 10 days, or not for months, but it will come. Castro took power in 1959 and quickly turned Cuba into a Marxist-Leninist country. Due to their previous economic interests in the country and their commitment to stopping the spread of communism, this made Cuba a target of the United States. As previously mentioned, the Bay of Pigs invasion further hurt the United States' perception, and Washington felt like they needed a win over Cuba. It is in this light that the Project Mongoose, focusing on the Cuban leader Fidel Castro's assassination, began. Even before this whole story begins, we will see the importance of image and propaganda, something that will come up again. As you will soon see, this story is as much about competing narratives as it is about assassinations. With that in mind, this is the narrative that we know today.
A litany of sources claim that Castro has survived 638 assassination attempts, and it's generally seen as common knowledge on the internet, sort of fun fact. However, looking closer at the sources reveals a few major inconsistencies. For example, Wikipedia states that the 638 number comes from a book by Fabián Escalante, which was then turned into a show called 638 Ways to Kill Castro. The problem arises when you realize that the number is given by Escalante at up to 634, not 638. Indeed, we found that Escalante's original book was called 634 Ways to Kill Fidel. The thing is, the show still cites the number as 638, so where did those extra 4 attempts come from? Either way, Escalante was the former Cuban chief of counterintelligence, and the man mostly responsible for protecting Castro. As such, let's call that 634 number the Cuban perspective. But what does the US say? Now, most nations would never confess to the attempted assassinations of foreign leaders, but the US does claim to have taken credit for every attempt they've committed. Here's a graph of the total amount of attempts between 1960 and 2000. This line is Escalante's Cuban perspective, and this is what the US claims. That's right, the US only claimed 8 attempts, with the final one happening in 1965, and not 2000 as Escalante claims. Naturally, there's room for skepticism here. The US and Cuba both have an incentive to either downplay or overplay the number of attempts, so it makes sense that they would contradict each other. But what does not make sense is this. Remember that asterisk above the Cuban perspective? That's because it isn't the only Cuban perspective. In 1975, Castro himself gave a report to US Senator George McGovern claiming there had been 24 attempts on his life by the CIA before 1971. With the amount of cover-ups and secrecy going on here, you might expect there to be a margin of error here. So maybe he could have missed 5 attempts or so. 10, less likely, but maybe still plausible. Castro would have missed 312. That's a margin of over 1,400%. Furthermore, the CIA claims responsibility for none of these, meaning their 8 were completely separate. If we take Castro at his word here, for Escalante's number to also be correct, the CIA would have to perform on average 1 attempt every other week for the next 25 years. An insane prospect. Then there's what happened just half a year later, On February 18, 1976, Gerald Ford signed an executive order halting the US government from assassinating foreign leaders whom they are not at war with. And according to several sources, this worked. The CIA had just had a lot of their shady dealings exposed to the public, so they stopped. Since Escalante claims that over 250 attempts happened after this order was signed, it becomes nearly impossible for this number to be correct. The CIA still has over 600 attempts to go at this point, and suddenly their time frame would have gone from 25 years to just 203 days. This graph shows the number of attempts per year that each perspective would need. Escalante's original estimation is already much higher, so where would the executive order fall? Well, what if I told you this isn't the end of the graph? You might have seen a few lines to the side of the video so far, but maybe you thought it was a mistake. It wasn't, because for the CIA to fulfill the original 634 number, they would have to do this. Even assuming all previous accounted for attempts are legitimate, the CIA would still need to perform an average of 1,100 attempts per year, or around 3 attempts per day. This is almost certainly impossible. The question now becomes, who lied? The difficult part of determining the truth here is that a lot of the files are classified, and are being declassified very slowly. In truth, while previous sources claimed that the CIA followed the Ford order, it turns out they just changed the name. Later declassified documents reveal quote-unquote targeted attacks against Gaddafi, Saddam, and Milosevic, stretching back to 1985, just 10 years after the signing of the order. Is it then such a stretch to think that the same could have happened to Castro? In the same vein, is it a stretch to say that Escalante is exaggerating his numbers for book sales or propaganda? Ultimately in this story, we're faced with two opposing views. If Escalante is telling the truth, the US is either lying or completely overlooked 630 assassination attempts by the CIA, including over 250 after Ford signed the order outlawing assassinations. It would also mean that Castro himself missed 312 attempts on his own life before 1975. Meanwhile, if the US is telling the truth, Escalante and Castro would both be making up over 600 attempts. The 24 attempts given to McGovern would also have to be either committed by some other third party, at which point the question is who that would be, or completely made up. So, if the number is this uncertain, how come so many sources claim it as a fact? The claim appears everywhere from The Guardian to Britannica to Wikipedia, so how did they all fall for it? In short, poor research. When Escalante released his book, the extravagant stories caught the attention of tabloid reporters, and they released articles on the insane ways that Castro almost died. Readers in turn cited these alongside the book itself on websites like Wikipedia, which in turn spread the story even further. With each news source, the claim appears to earn more veracity, even if it's all smoke and mirrors coming from the words of one man. This makes finding the truth really hard, as each of these sources contradict both each other and actual documentation from the time. In fact, we've almost certainly made mistakes in this video because of this. While you would expect academic articles or government documents to have the most information on Castro, the truth is that the most detailed sources in the story come from Vanity Fair, the BBC, or Triple J, all entertainment sites. So while we spent a lot of time searching through government documents to find the truth, we simply can't be sure. But whatever the story, the number of attempts may be, it doesn't hold a candle to some of the things the assassins supposedly tried.
The CIA's supposed methods of killing Castro were unorthodox, to say the least. Whether through explosives or a series of increasingly strange poisons, the attempts seem like something more akin to a James Bond novel than a legitimate government operation. It's likely due to some of these extraordinary claims that the Castro story has gotten so much traction. That being said, the nature of the story means we should take this all with a grain of salt. In the words of the CIA, efforts against Castro did not begin with assassination attempts. Instead, they made multiple attempts to discredit his image. A Church Committee report by the CIA, used earlier to justify their number of 8 attempts, lists two major attempts to disrupt Castro's image that give an idea of just how insane some of these plots were. Firstly, they implanted drugs with similar effects of LSD into a box of cigars and planned to spray the same drugs in a gaseous form into a room where Castro would be speaking, in an attempt to make him look crazy. They also felt his beard was too strong a symbol and tried to dust his shoes with thallium, a metal that would cause his beard to fall out. These schemes failed because Castro cancelled his trip, preventing the CIA from accessing his shoes. Moving on to assassinations, by far the most notable attempt is the exploding cigar. You may know of so-called loaded cigars, which are usually meant as harmless pranks or practical jokes. Well, the CIA decided that this was their key to getting Castro. There isn't a lot of information on this plot, and a book by David Hambling claims it to be a myth. But the story initially grew through journalists thinking it would be funny for one of the enemies of the US dying to a practical joke. But as it turns out, this myth isn't that far from reality. The CIA did try to poison a box of cigars that would then be sent to Castro. According to the committee reports, the cigars contained botulinum strong enough to kill immediately after it is placed in the victim's mouth. But the cigars never made it to Castro, and some sources claim they were delivered to an unidentified person in 1961. What happened after that is unknown. Then there's Castro's love of diving. Here the CIA painted a seashell with exotic colors, planted a bomb inside of it, and placed it near where Castro would be diving. The idea being that Castro would see the bright colors, want to pick it up, and, well. On top of this, they supposedly planned to give Castro a diving suit contaminated with tuberculosis and a fungus that would give him a chronic skin disease. James Donovan, a negotiator in previous US-Cuba deals, was given the assignment of giving Castro this suit. This failed spectacularly when Donovan picked the wrong suit. According to Richard Helms, soon to be a director of the CIA, the contaminated suit never left the lab. In another case, the CIA attempted to gift Castro a pen with a hypodermic needle hidden inside. The idea was for a Cuban official to give Castro the pen, which failed when the Cuban official said, surely the CIA could come up with something more sophisticated than that. The CIA eventually convinced him to take the pen, which was meant to be given on October 22nd, 1963, the same day as JFK's assassination. The pen never made it. These attempts are also the ones that have proper sources behind them. Escalante claims that even more absurd attempts, such as explosive-laden baseballs and pistols disguised as news cameras, but according to Escalante, the closest CIA ever got was later in 1963 when they made deals with a group called the Syndicate through mobster Sam Giancana to kill Castro. The mobsters figured out that Castro drank the same milkshake every day, so they enlisted one of the waiters to poison it. This failed when they found the poison had ripped open in the freezer and therefore could not be used. But we think there was one attempt that got even closer. This is Marita Lorenz, and if her story is to be believed, she was seconds away from killing Castro. Lorenz was Castro's ex-lover. They had supposedly met when Lorenz worked on a cruise ship where it was supposedly love at first sight. Years later, Lorenz would be given poison by the CIA, trained in Miami, and sent to kill Castro, but just like the previous story, the poison seal failed and was made unusable. Normally this is where the attempt would end, but it seems like Castro had other plans. When he came to Lorenz's hotel room, he strongly suspected that Lorenz was there to kill him. According to Lorenz, their interaction went like this. Castro asked if I was working for the CIA. I said, not really, I work for myself. Then he leaned over, pulled out his .45 and handed it to me. I flipped the chamber out and hid it back. He didn't even flinch, and he said, you can't kill me. Nobody can kill me. And he kind of smiled and chewed on his cigar. I felt deflated. He was so sure of me. He just grabbed me. We made love. I contemplated staying to try talking to him later, after his speech, but this would be too late, because he rambles on for 8, 10, 12 hours. That was the hardest part. I wanted him to beg me to stay, but he got dressed and left. Lorenz would leave Cuba the same day, and the CIA would never get as close to Castro ever again.
Castro would die in 2016 of natural causes. He spent the later parts of his life boasting about surviving the US, including the gold medal quote we showed earlier. In reality, the number of attempts was never in the hundreds, maybe not even in the tens. It would simply be impossible for the CIA to get anywhere near where Escalante claims. At the same time, Castro's report makes it seem pretty clear that there were more than 8 attempts. And yet, despite all its falsehoods and absurdities, the Cuban story is the one we know today. And we know it because it is precisely that, a good story. Whether there were actual exploding cigars or diving suits with tuberculosis doesn't matter. For Cuba, the story served to embarrass the US while glorifying Castro. And for the public, it's the closest we'll get to a real-life spy novel. The Cubans invented a story, and it worked flawlessly.